Hey everybody, this is Patrick from LSAT Lab. Let's talk about rebuttals in the logical reasoning section. It affects a whole lot of different question types. You got method, role, and main conclusion in the match family. It shows up a lot in the assumption objection family. The question disagree is literally about rebuttals. And then even in most supported questions, a lot of them like to test rebuttals. So let's start by just thinking about how we recognize a rebuttal. There's really a few different ingredients to most of them. An attribution, or like a common view, a pivot, and then some pushback. What the heck does that mean? Pause the recording and read these real quick. Welcome back. So the very first couple words here are an attribution. Weingarten claims that X. In the second one, it's a more off-screen hypothetical view, which might lead one to believe X. Pause the recording, try these. For the first one, we see many early discussions predicted that. So that is sort of a common view, not a specific person. And then in the second one, a specific person, Wilhelm Dörpfeld, he believed X. So when we spot an attribution, the goal of it is to prime your brain to be like, all right, and usually on LSAT, like 90% of the time or more, once I hear an attribution like Weingarten claims, many people argue, some might believe, that the next thing I'll experience will be the author pivoting away, but yet, however, nonetheless sort of thing. So pivots in general as an argument indicator signal the start of the author's argument and the end of like background to the end of a counterpoint. Pause the recording and check out this argument. Welcome back. There's a lot of keywords in this argument that can help us decipher what role each claim is playing. So we see Billy claims an attribution. And with the attribution, sometimes they just say one belief, but sometimes they offer an entire argument. And in this case, the word because, which we know indicates support, it's part of the famous FABS family. All of these are the main support indicators. That tells us that the second claim, how salsa is made from jalapenos, is supporting the conclusion that Paco's tacos are spicy. So we get a little argument, and we're waiting. Where's that pivot coming? Shaboom! And that sort of mentally allows you to think, okay, we're done with this background. Here comes my author. Now, is my author going to say a conclusion and then a premise, or a premise and then a conclusion? Again, we see the word since, one of fabs. So we know that the final claim is a premise, which means that he is likely exaggerating, is our conclusion. So what does a pivot do? It sort of helps you let the early stuff fade into the background, and it's a wake-up call that now you're hearing the author's voice, the author's actual argument. So if we revisit our arguments from before, is our attribution followed by a pivot? Shaboom. Shaboom, shaboom. Yes, it is. Our author's saying, but this prediction's unlikely to be borne out. We saw that Dörpfeld believed this city was Troy. And then we see a pivot, but that belief cannot be correct. You're going to prom with Dörpfeld? Here we saw Weingarten claim something, and then eventually we get to our pivot, however. And now notice the first couple ideas are since claim 1 and claim 2. That shows you that we're getting a pair of supporting ideas leading into this conclusion. His claim should be rejected. I'd rather go to prom with Weingarten than Dörpfeld. In the bottom one, we were being told that this might lead one to suspect plagiarism. However, it's more likely it was just a coincidence. And again, the very final claim is prefaced by a support indicator since. So we know we're ending premise and we're getting our conclusion right after the however. The third ingredient we talked about was pushback. So sometimes there isn't a pivot, you just notice that the author is disagreeing. His claim should be rejected. No, it's more likely this thing. Well, that prediction's unlikely to be borne out. Well, that belief can't be correct. So we have these three different tools, the attribution, the pivot, the pushback. Usually they're all there, but not necessarily. Go ahead and pause and decode this one. So we see a little attribution with retailers, a pivot with but, and then opinionated pushback. Too often, they resort to price cuts. Pause and try this one. Here we get the pushback first. Surely there'd be no problem accepting these, despite this attribution. So here it went pushback, pivot, attribution. Pause and read this one. This time around, there isn't a pivot. We're just seeing an attribution and a pushback. So we've spotted the rebuttal using any or all of these tools like attributions, pivots, and pushback. Now our job is to actually articulate what the rebuttal conclusion is saying, and we want to pay a lot of attention to its strength of wording. How harsh is it? How lenient? How tolerant? If we look back at our examples, Weingarten was claiming that keeping animals in zoos is unethical, and so by saying his claim should be rejected, we're really saying keeping animals in zoos is not unethical. And that's a double negative. We could even clean that up more and think our author is saying that keeping animals in zoos is ethical. Sometimes when they do main conclusion, they actually do write an answer like Weingarten's claim should be rejected. But most often that's not what happens. They use the language of the original person, but they translate it into the position the author is actually arguing. In our next example, we had this attribution that someone might think that plagiarism had happened. And then the pivot is pushing back and saying, no, it's more likely that it was a coincidence. And so here we just need to articulate, it's more likely it was a coincidence than it is that it was plagiarism. Pause the video and try to articulate these two conclusions to yourself. Welcome back. In the first case, many people had said, global warming is going to cause more frequent and intense tropical storms. And since our author is saying that prediction is unlikely to be borne out, we want the strength to reflect unlikely. I'm saying global warming is unlikely to cause more frequent and intense tropical storms. This argument did not age well. In the bottom, we're saying that Dorpfeld thought this ancient city was Troy. If you're saying that belief cannot be correct, then you're saying that ancient city cannot be Troy. Here's a real tough one. Pause and give this a try. What is the conclusion saying? So the economists theorized that growth was made possible by the spread of these two values, and our author's conclusion is prefaced by so, which always indicates a conclusion. She's saying we shouldn't accept this explanation until we have another piece of evidence. So we gotta make our rebuttal calibrated to that type of disagreement, a conditional one, a temporary. We want her to be saying it's currently premature to accept this explanation. We still need more data. Or we could say, until we know that there was a change in values, we should not accept this explanation. When we're articulating the rebuttal conclusion, we're just going to make sure that we match the author's strength of wording. Think about whether the author is saying the conclusion is wrong, probably wrong, less likely than something else, or maybe she's not even pushing back against the conclusion. Maybe she's saying, I don't trust the evidence, or more often, that evidence does not prove the conclusion. The argument fails to convince me of the conclusion. I'm not saying the conclusion's wrong, but I'm saying that your current set of evidence is incomplete. I ain't convinced. That's very, very frequently a nuance that they're testing us on. A big trend in main conclusion questions is that the conclusion has a pronoun. And so you want to make sure that you replace any pronouns with whatever wording they were referring to, which is called its referent, if we want to be fancy. So our conclusion here was no one should accept this explanation. This is a indicative pronoun. What is this explanation referring to? It's referring to the explanation that this growth was made possible by the spread of values like hard work and thrift. This growth? What growth are you referring to? We keep climbing the ladder. We're referring to when the productivity of the economy grew at a faster rate than the population grew. So we're importing all the referential language into the pronoun in order to get, it would be premature to accept that the spread of values of hard work and thrift allowed productivity to grow faster than population. All right, let's have some fun with this within question types. Now, main conclusion is arguably the most important time to know rebuttal arguments. Why? Because they're not trying to make it easy for us to find the conclusion. They don't want to say, thus, therefore, final claim, conclusion. That only happens about 10% of the time, that it's the last claim. So watch out for an answer that matches the last claim, because 90% of the time that's a trap. What we're going to see is the conclusion followed by support. So we got to get ready for an opinion that is then supported. In particular, main conclusion tends to either put the conclusion in the very first sentence or attach it to some pivot rebuttal moment of the paragraph. Most examples of main conclusion are rebuttals. Pause the recording and find a correct answer here. Welcome back. As we broke down before, there was an attribution that many early discussions were predicting something, pivot to the but, and then a pushback. This prediction's unlikely to be borne out. So what does this prediction refer to? I want to replace that pronoun. It's the prediction that there will be more frequent and intense tropical storms. That it would cause more frequent and intense tropical storms. Well, what does it refer to? It refers to global warming. So we're saying the prediction is that global warming will cause more frequent and intense tropical storms, and that's unlikely to be borne out. So we're saying global warming will probably not cause more frequent and intense tropical storms. And our correct answer literally says that with a couple words switched around. On main conclusion, you're doing all your work up front, and once you know the conclusion, you're only judging answers by do they or don't they say global warming will probably not cause more frequent and intense storms. Pause the recording and give this a try. Welcome back. We mentioned before that there's an attribution sort of off-screen, like some might suspect that plagiarism is to blame. However, pivot, I will push back. I think it's more likely it was a coincidence because we see the last claim is support. So our conclusion is it's more likely that it's because of a coincidence. More likely than what? It's more likely a coincidence than it is plagiarism. Our correct answer is D, which is just saying that same claim, but flipping the comparison. Instead of saying Billy's taller than Pam, it's saying Pam is shorter than Billy. Instead of saying it's more likely coincidence than plagiarism, it's saying it's less likely plagiarism than coincidence. One last one. Pause the recording and try this one. When we broke this one down before, we said that there's sort of an attribution when we hear about retailers. The pivot is what really wakes us up because we're doing main conclusion and we know 60% of them are attached to a pivot. And then we are like, okay, that blue is expressing the author's opinion. She's saying, I think they too often resort to using price cuts. She then defends it, supports it with her last couple claims. So our conclusion is they too often resort to price cuts. And who is they? They is retailers. So we could say that retailers are using advertised price cuts to promote their products too often. Notice that I switched from promote their wares into like a more familiar noun. Our correct answer here is a little bit harder to spot, but C is our best meaning match. To say advertised price cuts are overused is a nice match for they are used too often. Let's move on to a different question type. Flaw is the most common question type on the test, and we know that within it there are these 10 famous flaws that show up in half of the answer choices. And about a third of the time, these 10 famous flaws are the actual flaw. Well, 2 of them are related to rebuttals. So when you're doing a flaw question and you see a rebuttal, there's a couple things that should come to mind right away. Ad hominem and unproven versus proven false are 2 famous flaws, 2 of the 10. These other 3 things are way less common, and we're really only introducing a name so that you can sort of organize it in your head. Pause the recording and read over all 5 examples of rebuttal flaws. So ad hominem is a fancy Latin term that just means you're attacking the person, the source of the argument, rather than the argument itself. The structure of this is that you're saying, don't listen to him, ignore them. Why? The evidence will be saying, well, that source is disqualified. They have an ulterior motive. They have some biased interest. Or they have some conflicting past behavior or conflicting belief. Answer choices that are describing an ad hominem flaw won't say ad hominem, but they'll say that we're discrediting a view based on the source rather than the content, or that we're failing to address the merits of the position. LSAT wants us to engage with the merits of the opposition's evidence. If we're going to argue that the economy isn't doing well, how do we respond to the fact that recent job numbers suggest it is doing well? The other famous rebuttal flaw is unproven versus proven false. And in this case, the structure is you tell me in the premise that there's a lack of evidence for X, or that somebody who was trying to argue X had a fallacious assumption, an erroneous premise. And then you flip to the opposite pendulum and go, so I guess that proves that X is false. We're supposed to be thinking, just because they didn't prove X is true doesn't mean you proved X is false. And the answer choices would sound like, You're treating an absence of evidence as though it's evidence of absence, as though it proves your case that X is false. You're treating their failure to prove X is true as proof of your claim that X is false. Or you're inferring that a claim is false just because a crappy argument was made for it. Sometimes on Flaw, they really just want us to hear that a rebuttal is going off the rails. It is not staying on the conversation. So in this case, we had the president citing job improvement numbers, increased GDP, as reasons the economy is doing well. And then our author goes, she's got to be wrong. Our reputation on the world stage is a lot lower than it used to be. Okay, well, what does that have to do with anything? We're supposed to just react by thinking like your rebuttal has nothing to do with our economy. That has to do with like our foreign policy, our global standing. Now, obviously, what your country is doing economically could affect your country's reputation on the world stage, but this author has not drawn any connection. So right now, we're still allowed to be mad by being like, what does world stage reputation have to do with it? And as far as we know, our reputation is low on the world stage for some unrelated reason, like a scandal, not an economic reason. LSAT here just wants us to say that this author rejected a position on some irrelevant grounds, or at least on some grounds whose relevance is not clear. Straw man is not a term that LSAT ever uses, but it's a good thing to know for real life, because this is how political discourse breaks down. People don't respond to a charitable version of the position they're disagreeing with. They respond to a ridiculous version. So straw man takes an original position like, how about we lower the corporate tax rate? That'll incentivize more businesses to come here. And then when you hear them shift to like, well, I think if the government doesn't charge corporations any taxes, the original person would be like, I never said don't charge them any taxes. I said lower them from 32 to 25%. The most common thing we're doing with rebuttals in the assumption objection family is reconciling this author's objection with the original position. Our author is saying she's not a movie lover. After all, she's never seen Casablanca. And so we just need to now fight the fight of like, okay, given that she's never seen Casablanca, how can I argue that she is a movie lover? We could make up a million different excuses. We could just say, hey, not all movie lovers have seen Casablanca. That works as an answer. We could say, oh, she desperately wants to, but her puppy died in Casablanca, so it's sort of a triggering movie for her. That's why she hasn't. So all you have to do is work within the space of how can I construct a story where a movie lover has not seen Casablanca. Let's try some Flaw questions. Pause the recording and give this a try. Welcome back. First, we got to just break down the argument, find the conclusion and the evidence. So we're reading this and it starts with an attribution. An art historian argues. Then we can see that we're getting a premise, so the historian's conclusion is going to come after the comma. Because of premise that 15th century painters were more planimetric than 16th, we get to this conclusion that 15th century painters had greater mastery. Now, of course, we're expecting a pivot because we just heard somebody else make an argument, and sure enough, we get our however. We sort of wash away those first couple lines, and we think, all right, author, what's happening? We can see that we're getting our conclusion first and our premise second because for is part of fabs. That last claim is support. So our author is saying this conclusion is wrong. And if we articulate the rebuttal conclusion, we're saying 15th century painters did not have a greater mastery of painting than 16th. Well, why not? How do you know they didn't have greater mastery? Because the extent to which something's planimetric reveals nothing about mastery. When you read it in the flow, this argument doesn't sound crazy, but picture this on an island. The author's trying to convince an audience 15th century painters did not have greater mastery than 16th. And all the art historians in the audience are like, what do you mean? And then he goes, well, how planimetric a painting is tells us nothing about the painter's mastery. They'd be like, sure, that's fair, but get back to the whole 15th versus 16th. Where's your evidence for that? The author has no evidence for that. She's not producing any evidence about 15th century painters versus 16th century painters. So how did her argument feel sensible when it is actually this crazy and incomplete? Well, she's reacting to an original position and saying, since your reason for believing that position was dumb, the planimetric has nothing to do with mastery, I guess I can just shoot down your position. The responsible conclusion recognizes that you have not yet proven 15th century painters are better. The irresponsible conclusion goes too far and says, without any evidence, they are not better. So this is unproven versus proven false. The correct answer is E. We are rejecting a position. On the grounds that is a reference to your argument's support, so we should be able to match this with the premise that came after the word for. Was the premise saying that an inadequate argument was made for the claim that 15th century painters were better? It's not explicitly saying that, but it is definitely implying it. Our author is saying, the reason you guys cited about 15th century being more planimetric, that has nothing to do with mastery. So if the premise is unrelated to the conclusion, clearly that is an inadequate argument. Every part of E matches, and so we would pick it and say, yep, that looks good. The other four answers here were also famous flaws. Ad hominem was saying, let's reject this position because of who this person is and what else he believes. B was talking about using the same word two different ways, equivocating mastery. Like, are we talking about expertise, or are we talking about like one person being the master of another? Necessary versus sufficient refers to making a conditional logic mistake, doing an illegal negation or an illegal reversal. And then D is self-contradiction, which is one of the 10 famous flaws, but only because it shows up all the time in answer choices. You almost never see a genuine self-contradiction. Pause the recording and try this one. Welcome back. We broke down this argument earlier. We know that Weingarten is claiming that keeping animals in zoos is unethical, and he does have a premise. Why? Well, because you're placing animals in an unnatural environment for the sake of your human amusement. You disgust me. The rebuttal conclusion is saying his claim should be rejected for two reasons. The evidence combines. He's basically saying, well, keeping a house pet is also putting an animal in an unnatural environment for human amusement, and you don't see anything wrong with that, you hypocrite. So this is an ad hominem flaw. You're either invalidating someone's view by saying that they are biased or by saying they're like a hypocrite. Here, our author is saying, so keeping animals in zoos is ethical. You hypocrite. Again, if you looked at this argument in a vacuum, it looks insane. I'm going to go up to a stage and convince an audience that keeping animals in zoos is ethical. All right, we're ready. Convince us. Well, everybody, as you know, keeping a house pet involves placing an animal in an unnatural environment for the sake of human amusement, and Weingarten doesn't see anything wrong with that. Who's Weingarten? When are you going to talk about zoos? That's how stupid this argument is. When you're doing ad hominem, you're just disqualifying the person, not the ideas. So the correct answer is E. The structure of ad hominem is that we are saying, let's dismiss this point of view. Let's ignore it. Why? Because the person who's saying it either is biased or is kind of a hypocrite. So our correct answer is saying that the author rejected a claim, and then the premise, the grounds on which she did it, was that he holds a view that contradicts it. So again, inconsistent is a synonym for contradictory. If you think keeping animals in zoos is unethical because it's an unnatural environment for the sake of human amusement, then you should also think that having a house pet is unethical, because it also is the same thing. It involves putting an animal in an unnatural environment for human amusement. So the view that it's okay to own pets is inconsistent with the view that it's not okay to put animals in zoos. Again, most of the other answers are famous flaws. B refers to sampling. C actually refers to straw man, which is not one of the famous flaws, but we just talked about it a second ago. And D, once again, is busting out necessary versus sufficient, an illegal reversal or an illegal negation of conditional logic. All right, one more. Pause and give this flaw question a try. Welcome back. So we start off with an attribution, and then we see that there is a because and an and. So this is a little mini argument. We're going to have a conclusion followed by two supporting ideas that are held in tandem by that and. The critic is trying to convince us that a negative news report on the economy can harm the economy, because those sorts of reports damage people's confidence in the economy, and then that makes them less willing to spend money. Our author then pivots with a but, so now we focus on these last couple ideas because this is her argument. The word thus is telling us that the final claim will be the conclusion. If she's saying that they're mistaken, she is saying it can't harm the economy. Why? Because your willingness to spend money is correlated with confidence in your own immediate economic situation. So in a sense, she seems to be disagreeing with a premise. She seems to be thinking that a lack of confidence in the economy is not going to make you spend less money. You're going to decide how much money to spend based on your confidence in your own economic situation. There's no famous flaw here. The author's definitely engaging with the argument. We just need to try to reconcile the author's evidence with the original position. So given that people's willingness to spend money seems to track with confidence in their own economic situation, how can we argue that a negative news report on the economy really could harm the economy? Well, we could argue that a negative news report on the economy can hurt someone's confidence in their own immediate economic situation. It might not immediately do so, but maybe the negative news makes you less confident about the economy, and that makes you less confident about your own immediate economic situation, and that makes you less willing to spend money, and therefore we've defended the idea that a negative news report can actually harm the economy by leading to less spending. Now that we've thought of a way to reconcile the author's rebuttal premise with that original position that she's rebutting, we have a pretty good objection. Let's go to the answers thinking, hey, maybe a negative news report can affect people's confidence in their economic situation. A and D are the two answers that are sort of talking about that. But A is saying that confidence in your own situation would affect how you perceive the overall state of the economy. That doesn't do anything for us as an objection. We're trying to get from negative news report to I'm less willing to spend money. So I need the negative news report to be causing me to be less confident about my economic situation. So D is our correct answer because it's saying the negative news report makes you less confident in the economy overall. And then usually that means you start feeling pessimistic about your own immediate situation. And that's how we get to you spending less money. So A was reversing the flow of causality that we're using in order to make this rebuttal. So A has the objection we wanted, but it reversed the cause-effect relationship. Let's talk about rebuttals intersecting with assumption questions. Now, assumption questions are always either testing a missing link or a ruled out objection. So in some cases, we will be linking language from the author's evidence to language from the rebuttal conclusion. And other times when we're trying to think of objections so that we could maybe rule them out, we'll just be thinking, how could I, allow that author's premise to be true, but reconcile it with the original position and say, okay, well, the original position could still be correct. Go ahead and pause the recording and give this one a try. Welcome back. We got attribution language right out of the gate. The recent claims that, and so the opposing position itself is that the Tasmanian tiger is not extinct. And then our author is saying that's false. All right, so she's saying that it is extinct. All right, why should we believe that the Tasmanian tiger is extinct? Because its habitat has been taken over by farming. It's been systematically eliminated from its habitat. And people working in the area don't see any evidence of it. There's no carcasses, there's no tracks. So from a linking perspective, we would need to get language like, all right, if you've been systematically eliminated from your habitat and there's no hard evidence of you in the region, then extinct. If we're trying to think of objections, we're going to think, how can I reconcile this evidence with the original position that the Tasmanian tiger is not extinct, it's still alive? Given that they've been eliminated from their habitat, how could we say they're still alive? I don't know, we could say they moved to a new habitat. Given that there's no hard evidence of them in the region, how could we say that they're still alive? Maybe we're looking in the wrong places for the evidence. I don't know, maybe animals ate the carcasses or rain washed away the tracks. Once we come up with objections, we can turn them into assumptions by just negating them. The tigers did not move to a new habitat. Other animals didn't eat the carcasses, etc. Looking at the answers, A is wrong because starvation is just too specific and out of scope. We know they were driven from their habitat, but it doesn't have to be because of starvation. They could have been poisoned, they could have been murdered, they could have been intimidated, it doesn't matter. B actually sounds like one of our objections. It's not ruling out the idea that animals ate carcasses. It's literally saying, well, what if the animals ate the carcasses? So that would weaken. C is too extreme. The author does not need to assume that 100% of naturalists have looked systematically for evidence. And then D is the correct answer. It actually matches one of our objections just ruled out. The tiger didn't move to a new habitat. So D is correct. We don't necessarily have to predict that answer. We just have to be receptive to it. And what that means is we have to think, all right, well, the original position was that the tiger is not extinct, and the author is saying, that can't be. They've been forced from their habitat, and we have no hard evidence of them existing in the region. So as long as we're in this sort of headspace of like, how can I accept that but still say that the Tasmanian tiger is alive? Then when we look at D, naturally we negate it because it's got that word not. When we see not in necessary assumption, it's very lovable, but it means we negate it and we see, would it weaken? So if I say that the Tasmanian tiger did just move and adapt to a different region, yeah, that gives me a great way to argue that it's still alive. When we negate E, it is a little bit tempting because it's saying the people that allegedly have sighted the tiger are experienced naturalists, so therefore it's still alive. But that line of objection is pretty weak because the text told us that it is also naturalists working in the region who can't find any hard evidence. So yeah, maybe they thought they saw the tiger, but they still have no evidence to back it up. When we are comparing D versus E, we're basically thinking which of these weakens more. And D makes it much easier. We can say, yeah, I get it. They were eliminated from this habitat. There's no evidence in this region of them, but that's because they moved somewhere else. They're still alive. Whereas with E, it's a much weaker objection. It's like, yeah, I know they've been booted from this region and we have no evidence of them being here, but there was a naturalist that thought they saw one. Let's talk about how this will show up in most supported. Most supported and must be true come from the inference family, where you're usually not reading arguments at all. You're just reading facts and statements. But fill in the blank most supported, a lot of times we'll do rebuttals. So if we're doing most supported and it looks like we're dealing with a rebuttal paragraph, then generally the correct answer sounds a lot like the rebuttal conclusion, but crucially, don't be too strong with disagreeing. Pause the video and give this a try. Welcome back. So in fill in the blank, we're usually trying to derive a reasonable conclusion. This paragraph starts with an attribution, and it turns out that it's actually a mini argument, that because of this first claim, you get the main position, that morality is entirely by culture, it's not grounded in some universal human nature. Then we see our author saying this argument is flawed. That's different from saying this conclusion is false. What she's saying is that premise does not prove that conclusion. So we want to be careful with our wording. But if we were just looking at flipping the conclusion, we'd be saying, what do you mean? It's still possible that morality is grounded in some universal human nature. And if we compare that to the answers, the only answer that really has that sort of wording is C, where it's talking about morality being based in or grounded in something universal, something shared. A actually goes the opposite direction, where it is saying morality gets contextualized. It's not coming from some common thing. It's based in specific cultures, not general human nature. So that's the opposite of what we wanted. B is too strong. The word most is always scary to us. And it's just saying that the moral codes resemble each other. It's not speaking to where they come from. Are they resembling each other because these cultures are copying each other, or because morality is grounded in some universal human nature? D is saying that it's possible to understand the basis, but what is the basis? Is it just culturally specific, or is there something fundamental about human nature that moral codes are based in? E is the most tempting trap answer because it kind of sounds like we've got this universal morality, but we can adapt it to suit the moral codes of different cultures. However, E doesn't say anything about universal morality. C is the only thing where we say shared moral attitudes, where we touch on the idea of universal. Furthermore, if we compare this language to the paragraph, what we were saying in that setup is just as universal tastes like sweet and salt, can provide the basis for different cuisines. Universal moral attitudes can provide the basis for different moral codes. So the language of C tracks much better to the analogy that we're trying to complete. Finally, let's take a look at how rebuttals intersect with method questions. Method questions ask us to characterize an argument or to characterize a response, and there's really 4 patterns that show up over and over again. The person who is doing the rebuttal will often be pointing out a dubious assumption that the opponent is making. They will sort of talk about the implications of that person's logic or of their plan and say, don't you see that it takes you somewhere untrue or it takes you somewhere undesirable? Or they might react to a causal argument and say, ooh, have you considered this alternate explanation? Or finally, they might just raise some overlooked consideration that reframes the conversation. These names can potentially be overlapping. If you raise an alternate explanation, that's kind of like an overlooked consideration. You're saying, well, you're assuming that this isn't what's going on. Pause the recording and read through all 4 of these and try to describe them using the language above. Welcome back. When we read about these researchers, they were trying to figure out why twice as many 50-year-olds as 20-year-olds say that they sometimes give blood. And their explanation was that 50-year-olds are more altruistic than 20-year-olds. But this author is saying, I don't know, it could just be that 50-year-olds are afraid to admit they don't give blood because they know that that's kind of expected of them. So this is providing an alternate explanation, and the correct answer literally says that. It says that the reasoning above calls into question this conclusion by offering an alternate explanation. Flynn and Garcia were talking about suing companies and getting huge rewards. And Garcia was pushing back by saying, well, we got to watch out. If you don't put a limit on how much you can get back from a corporation, then you can destroy the corporation, the people that work there will lose their jobs, and overall that harms the economy and consumers. So Garcia is talking through implications or consequences of what happens when you let people collect large damage awards from suing corporations. So we might describe this with flawed consequences, flawed implications. And the correct answer says that Garcia responds by arguing that it could result in some undesirable consequences. In this argument, the critic was saying, you screwed up again. You said that if we didn't change our policies, we'd go into recession, but we're clearly not in a recession. And the economist is saying, yeah, that's because we changed policies, bro. So we would probably call that like an overlooked consideration. It feels like the economist is saying, you're overlooking that we did change economic policies, so my prediction's not relevant anymore. The correct answer here could be saying, you're assuming we didn't change policies, but we did. Or you're overlooking that we did change policies. The actual correct answer is a mean one here. It says that the economist indicates the state of affairs on which her prediction was conditioned did not obtain. So she had a conditional prediction. If we don't change our current policies, we'll go into recession. But she's saying, well, that didn't obtain. We did change policies. So you can't judge my prediction because the trigger was never fired. In this last one, West is saying that Haynes must be the worst inspector because more than half of the items that come back having defects were inspected by Haynes. And Young is pointing out that, well, yes, but Haynes actually inspects most items, so we would expect most returns to have been inspected by Haynes. We could say that that's an overlooked consideration. Like West, you're overlooking that Haynes does the majority of the inspection, so naturally the majority of the defects will have been inspected by him. We could call it an alternate explanation for why half of the defects were inspected by Haynes. The answer actually describes it in terms of a dubious assumption. It says that Young is denying one of West's presuppositions, which means assumptions. And what they're referring to is West is assuming that these 3 quality control inspectors inspect roughly the same amount of items. She's assuming that Haynes only inspects around a third of the items, and so if half of the defects coming back are from Haynes, that looks pretty bad. All right, gang, let's wrap it up. You guys did great. That was a long, dense lesson. Quick takeaways. In main, conclusion, and role, we know that they like to hide the conclusion, and so most of those arguments are rebuttal style. And we're normally not going to see the conclusion with obvious therefore, thus, last claim type hints. Instead, we're usually going to find it by pivots and pushback. When we're doing method, we just want to remember that the 4 common forms of rebuttals are pointing out an assumption your opponent is making, suggesting an alternate explanation for the data they're considering, showing how their logic or their plan has implications that reduce to absurdity or take us somewhere undesirable, or just bringing up some overlooked consideration that really changes the way you think about the original argument. In the world of Flaw, there are 2 famous rebuttal flaws, ad hominem and unproven versus proven false, and then there's 3 fuzzier trends, sort of misinterpreting or misrepresenting what the first person said, responding in kind of an irrelevant way, or responding in a way that is still very compatible with the original claim. When we're dealing with rebuttals on assumption or strengthen, weaken, evaluate, sometimes they'll be testing the linking ideas, like what language from the author's evidence has to be linked up to language in this rebuttal conclusion. More frequently, they're testing our ability to reconcile. How can we accept the author's evidence, but still believe or fight for the original position? And when we do most supported questions and we're reading a rebuttal, the answer will usually sound like the rebuttal conclusion, but it'll be very safely worded, so be careful about going too far and saying that idea is trash. Try to hedge your wording and look for something like, that idea is poorly supported. All right, that'll do it for today's lesson. Please check out our other videos on YouTube or come visit us at lsatlab.com.